He came home that evening to find his wife on the front porch, shaken and bruised, clutching the edge of the railing as if it were her lifeline. Lena's normally bright eyes were reddened, her lips quivered with silent shock. The air was thick with tension. There was no question that something terrible had happened. "I'm okay," she whispered, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. He said he was with the HOA. Told me our fence was out of compliance. I tried to explain, but..." He crouched in front of her, hands gentle on her shoulders, feeling the hardness of her fear settled like a stone in his chest. She looked so small, so wounded. It wasn't just a physical wound, a split lip, a bruise forming on her cheek. It was the violation of safety, of trust. Something fundamental had snapped. The man had not introduced himself as an HOA enforcer, his eyes cold, his tone official. He pointed at the fence, at the angle of the pickets, at the color fading under the summer sun. He quoted clause and code. He demanded correction. But when Lena asked for identification, asked for paperwork, he sneered. There was no paperwork. No city badge. No official letter. Just intimidation, rising into violence. A shove. A strike across the face. An assault over a fence. That night, he felt something harden inside him. A combat medic by training, a veteran by necessity, he had healed wounds in war zones. He had pulled his brothers and sisters back from the brink. He had steadied delirious bodies as blood poured past his gloves. But nothing, he thought, had prepared him for seeing his own wife hurt like this, by someone wielding the facade of authority. He spent the night researching. He dug through HOA charters, municipal codes, private management agreements. He cross-checked phone numbers, corporate ties, signatures on letters that never existed. Lesson by lesson, he realized this wasn't random. It was controlled. Planned. When he spoke with others in the neighborhood, young vets, retired teachers, widows living on fixed incomes, patterns turned into networks. Nasty letters labeled them. Non-compliant. Threats of liens, foreclosure. Contractors said to inspect. Tires slashed. Sprinklers sabotaged. Cameras installed on trees. It was no longer about property values. It was about profit. Displacement. Extraction. He called a meeting. Kept it small. Held it in the quiet safety of his own kitchen. There were 5 of them at first. An older couple whose lawn had mysteriously turned brown. A recent widow whose utility box had been tampered with. A teacher whose walkway lights had vanished. Lena sat at the head of the table, her presence quiet but resolute. "This stops now," she declared. He looked at her, pride mixing with fear in his gut. They started gathering evidence. Photos. Videos. Logs of phone calls. Dates of incidents. They cataloged violations that, on the surface, appeared petty. A faded mailbox, an untrimmed hedge, but when listed together showed the pattern. Selective enforcement on elderly homeowners, under-resourced families, veterans. Resource-efficient targets, he thought, ripe for financial despair. He tapped into his military skills. Not for violence, but for investigation. Surveillance tactics became data gathering. Communication chains were traced, digital footprints uncovered. He discovered hidden camera feeds accessible from private servers. He found contractor invoices issued in the names of shell companies, routed through law firms in distant states. Letters of non-compliance were signed by a woman named Karen, apparently the HOA president, but there was no evidence she actually lived here. It was a facade. An excuse. A legal fig leaf. And behind it, somewhere deeper, was a man, Ward Lom. Ran shell companies. Controlled asset seizure networks. Took foreclosure proceeds, flipped houses, pushed clients into mortgage schemes. He counted on HOA boards, easy proxies. He counted on fear. He counted on isolation. They built a coalition. Fell into late-night strategy sessions. He mapped alliances. Lena organized community support. A young tech volunteer offered to hack the HOA's encrypted systems, secure email servers, digital document repositories. Slowly, painstakingly, they broke in. Files on file, meeting minutes, past board resolutions, hidden contracts, emails planning forced compliance sweeps. Weekend squads of contractors, armed with cameras and cease and desist letters, showing up unannounced at defenseless homeowners. They recruited whistleblowers, an HOA employee who'd been paid hush money, a clerk in one of the mortgage management firms, a contractor disgusted by the malicious work. Each provided testimony, sometimes recorded in secret, sometimes under oath. Their words pulled the curtain back. Next came a leak. Carefully timed. Evidence dropped to select journalists. Public records requested. A local news crew knocked on his door, lenses pointed and ready. The story exploded. Front page headlines. HOA enforcer convicted of assault. Hidden cameras revealed. Financial paper trails exposed. Owners paying thousands in bogus fines. The board under investigation. Federal agents logged in. Subpoenas issued. Houses listed for resale under dubious foreclosure notices were frozen in place. Their neighborhood turned uneasy. Rich folks who'd never attended a meeting realized their homes were subsidizing predatory actions. Retirees who'd quietly paid dues felt betrayed. Local politicians smelled heat. Pressure mounted. He watched the dominoes fall. Karen, the president, resigned. The board was replaced. Shell companies' bank accounts frozen. Ward Lom unmasked as a ringleader in a fraud scheme targeting HOAs across multiple states. Federal charges, racketeering, conspiracy, civil rights violations, brought him down. Back on the block, there was a change in the air. A cleanup of overgrown lots. Cameras removed. Official notices mailed. The neighborhood council had a public meeting, open to all residents, with new bylaws, transparency commitments, legal checks. People came in droves. They demanded protections, oversight committees, financial audits, compliance transparency. They wanted change that couldn't be reversed. In the midst of it all, he sat on his porch with Lena at his side. Evening settled over trimmed lawns, healthy trees, united neighbors. He thought of the war zones he'd left behind. Desert heat, mud, mortar. There had been violence there too, but nothing like this, disarming a community of trust and safety. Here, victory felt different, gentler, but just as vital. Justice, they realized, wasn't reserved for courtrooms. It lived in kitchens and living rooms, in shared stories and collective courage. It demanded attention, unity, stubborn good faith. They guarded their peace now, not with weapons, but with awareness. When federal agents came by to ask questions, Lena joined him at the table. They answered together. A partnership in truth. A union in purpose. There was celebration in subtle ways. A block barbecue to honor survivors and whistleblowers. A yard where kids played next to the repaired fence. A plaque in the community hall dedicating transparency advocates. The message was clear. This town belonged to its people, not to fear, not to financial vultures, not to silent complicity. Months later, at a federal hearing, he listened as Ward Lom was sentenced. 8 years for conspiracy. 6 for civil rights. Fines. Restitution. He didn't cheer. He felt relief. He felt something larger than himself. A lesson in resilience, in accountability. A lesson that power, no matter how well fenced, can crumble under scrutiny. He walks his dog each morning, past that fence, perfect now, upright, painted, unassuming. And he sees Lena watering flowers. She smiles and waves. He waves back, knowing they earned this stillness. Earned it with courage, with cold analysis, with warm hearts. Earned it with every neighbor who stood with them when the darkness came calling. But victory wasn't instant, nor was it simple. In the days after the initial media firestorm, their neighborhood became a place split between relief and suspicion. Some residents, frightened of retaliation, stopped talking altogether. Others buzzed with questions, whispering in grocery aisles and leaning over fences. There were neighbors who blamed him and Lena for bringing bad attention, worried about property values, while others dropped off casseroles and thank you notes on their porch. He understood the fear. He'd seen it before, in soldiers forced to keep secrets, in locals terrified to be labeled traitors. When power is abused, it trains people to silence themselves. That was how these predators thrived. He tried to speak to anyone who would listen, assuring them that sunlight, however harsh, was the only thing that could disinfect corruption. But he also recognized that their fight had barely begun. In those first weeks, the HOA went suspiciously quiet. No newsletters. No new fines. But strange cars still appeared late at night, idling on corners. Contractors kept creeping along property lines, peering into yards. Lena started noticing the same silver SUV parked at different angles on their street, its driver pretending to check his phone. He installed new cameras, this time, pointed outward. It wasn't just neighbors that came forward. Contractors started whispering too. A landscaper named Devin, who'd once been hired by the HOA, confessed that he'd been paid under the table to, accidentally, cut sprinkler lines in targeted yards. Another man, a handyman, revealed that he'd been instructed to take photos of messy yards, but never of certain properties, even when those properties were genuinely dilapidated. Patterns kept emerging. The more he dug, the clearer it became. This was not simply local greed. It was an organized machine. One of the scariest revelations came from a quiet woman named Alice, who'd worked briefly for Civic Asset Solutions. She arrived at a single mom named Jasmine broke down in tears, describing how her toddler's plastic slide was labeled a safety hazard, leading to escalating fines. A contractor showed up with orders to remove it while she was at work. When she protested, she received threats of legal action for hostility toward HOA representatives. Each story fed his fury. He kept organizing. Held meetings in his garage. Printed handouts explaining residents' legal rights. Taught neighbors how to file formal complaints, record encounters, and demand documentation. Slowly, the neighborhood shifted. At first, people were timid, scared to speak out. But as they compared letters and invoices, they saw how the tactics matched. The same phrases appeared across multiple documents. The same contractors showed up over and over. Residents realized they weren't isolated cases. They were part of a systematic scheme. That was when the tide truly turned. One night, a secret meeting in his garage grew so crowded that people spilled onto the driveway. A retired judge stood up and volunteered pro bono legal aid. A group of veterans formed a watch team to follow suspicious vehicles around the neighborhood. A couple of tech-savvy teenagers offered to help trace IP addresses and domain registrations. Lena stood at the front of the garage, her voice ringing out. They thought they could scare us into silence. They were wrong. Cheers filled the night air. Meanwhile, local journalists dug deeper. Sarah, the young reporter who'd first run their story, kept publishing articles. She obtained court documents revealing how HOAs had transferred properties directly to shell companies for pennies on the dollar. She exposed how liens were filed without court review. How emergency board meetings were held secretly to authorize mass fines against selected residents. He and Lena became both heroes and targets. One evening, he came home to find their mailbox torn off its post and dumped in their yard. Another night, they found red spray paint scrawled across their garage door. Shut up or else. He called the police. Officers took statements, but admitted their hands were tied unless someone was caught in the act. Civil disputes, they called it. Still, he refused to be intimidated. He made multiple backup copies of the files Alice had given them. He stored them in safe deposit boxes, encrypted cloud drives, even handed a copy to a trusted friend out of state. Redundancy is survival, he reminded Lena. One afternoon, Sarah arrived at their door, holding a manila envelope with trembling hands. Inside were printouts of internal HOA emails she'd obtained from a whistleblower. The subject lines read like military operations. Operation Vet Filtering, Phase 3, Quiet Removals, Targets, Widows, NO Family, Disability Rating 50%. Lena gasped as she read the list of names. Some of the neighbors they knew. He felt his fists clench so hard his knuckles cracked. We have to go public with this. Now! Sarah agreed. But carefully. If we leak everything at once, they'll discredit it. We release it piece by piece. Build public outrage. So began the slow, strategic leak. Each week, Sarah published a new piece, exposing another layer of the conspiracy. Public reaction snowballed. HOA law firms started releasing statements denying wrongdoing. Civic Asset Solutions vanished overnight, their website wiped clean. Ward Lom released a carefully worded denial, calling himself a humble businessman devoted to neighborhood improvement. But the truth had already taken root. He and Lena were invited to speak at town halls. Radio hosts called for interviews. A national veterans group offered to sponsor legal representation for any veteran threatened by HOA action. Yet, even amid these victories, there were moments of darkness. One night, driving home from a community meeting, he noticed headlights following him for miles. When he finally pulled over, the car sped past, but not before he caught a glimpse of the driver glaring at him through the window. Another night, Lena woke him in a panic. Someone had knocked on their door at 3 a.m. By the time he grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door, whoever it was had vanished, leaving nothing but tire tracks in the grass. Each incident stoked the neighborhood's determination. A young man named Kyle, a Marine Corps vet, summed it up at the next HOA meeting. Standing tall in the middle of the crowded community hall, he declared, "We've been shot at, bombed, and burned out overseas. You think we're gonna be scared of fines and fake violations? Hell no. Not here." The room erupted in cheers, but the final nail in the corrupt HOA's coffin came when Josh, the tech-savvy volunteer, managed to crack an encrypted server owned by Civic Asset Solutions. Inside were spreadsheets revealing tens of millions in revenue generated by forced property sales. Detailed memos showed plans to expand into 20 more communities across 4 states. They had PowerPoint slides titled, "Eviction Velocity Metrics." He stared at those slides, rage boiling in his chest. Eviction velocity. As if human lives were nothing but commodities on an assembly line, Sarah published the evidence in a sweeping expose. National media picked it up. Federal agents arrived the next day, armed with warrants. HOA board members were summoned to testify. Bank accounts were frozen. Ward Lom was arrested at an airport attempting to board a private plane to Belize. In one explosive week, the entire corrupt apparatus collapsed. Neighbors gathered on his lawn, hugging one another, weeping with relief. Mrs. Hernandez brought homemade empanadas and cried as she handed him the plate. "You saved us," she whispered, but he shook his head. "No, senora. We saved each other." And while the battle was far from over, that night he stood under the stars with Lena, arms wrapped around each other, feeling, for the first time in a long while, that the darkness might finally be lifting. In the days following the arrests, the neighborhood seemed to exhale in cautious relief. But beneath that breath, a persistent undercurrent of anxiety still pulsed. Neighbors would glance out windows whenever unfamiliar cars rolled slowly by. Children were gently warned not to stray too far down the street alone. Packages left on porches were brought inside swiftly, as though people half expected them to contain threats instead of deliveries. He and Lena knew that just because Ward Lom was behind bars didn't mean the war was over. The federal investigation kept revealing new names and new angles. Journalists uncovered ties between Civic Asset Solutions and shadowy private equity firms that specialized in buying distressed housing portfolios. These firms had quietly been acquiring properties across entire zip codes, sometimes under 20 different LLCs. One night, Lena and he sat on their porch, reading yet another article about another neighborhood hundreds of miles away where residents were suddenly being fined thousands of dollars for trivial offenses. Lena lowered the newspaper, her voice low. "It's like whack-a-mole. We shut down one group, and 2 more pop up somewhere else." He sighed. "That's how it works. It's a business model now." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "Then we changed the model." A few days later, the new HOA board, now led by Jim Carson, organized the largest community meeting the neighborhood had ever seen. People packed into the community hall, folding chairs filling every inch of floor space, with more residents spilling out onto the sidewalks outside. Jim stood at the front, clearing his throat. "First off, we owe a debt of gratitude to the folks who refused to let us be bullied. You know who you are." He gestured toward him and Lena. Applause broke out, growing louder, sustained, until it filled the entire hall. Lena blushed, looking down. He gave a short nod, humbly, but Jim raised a hand for silence. "This isn't just a moment to celebrate. This is a moment to plan. Because this neighborhood is safe now, but others aren't. And we have a duty." People murmured agreement. Mrs. Hernandez stood slowly, leaning on her cane. Her voice, though soft, carried over the crowd. "I want to help the people who can't help themselves. The older folks. The veterans. The widows. The ones who don't have a son or daughter nearby to fight for them." A wave of emotion swept through the hall. He rose to his feet. "Then let's make it official. Let's form a neighborhood alliance. Not just for us, but for anyone going through what we did." The hall erupted in cheers, and so began the Neighborhood Integrity Alliance. Over the next few weeks, he and Lena, alongside other residents, worked tirelessly. They drafted mission statements. They gathered volunteer lawyers, journalists, tech specialists. They built a website where homeowners across the country could upload suspicious letters anonymously and find legal resources. They hosted online seminars teaching people how to recognize predatory tactics, how to read HOA bylaws, and how to document intimidation. The group's message spread fast. Calls came in from as far away as Oregon and Maine. People shared stories, some nearly identical to theirs, some even worse. A veteran in Texas explained how he'd been forced into foreclosure over excessive yard decor because he'd hung military memorabilia in his yard. A widow in Georgia described being fined $10,000 for unauthorized plantings, which turned out to be wildflowers planted by her late husband decades ago. Each news story fueled their resolve. One night, he and Lena were up past midnight, replying to emails, when he paused and stared at the glow of his laptop screen. "Do you think we'll ever be finished fighting this?" he asked quietly. Lena closed her laptop and leaned back. "No," she said, "because there will always be someone trying to take what isn't theirs. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting." He reached across the table. Meanwhile, the media kept pounding the story. National networks ran primetime specials, with titles like Neighborhood Nightmares and HOA's Gone Rogue. Legislators from multiple states began introducing new laws based on their case, proposing mandatory oversight of HOA financial records, restrictions on fines, and stronger homeowner protections. Federal investigators kept working. Each new arrest brought fresh headlines. Civic Asset Solutions executives faced fraud charges. Lawyers, who had written threatening letters for shell companies, were subpoenaed to testify about illegal collusion. One morning, while reading the news on his phone, he saw a photo of Ward Long in an orange jumpsuit, sitting in a courtroom, his once confident smirk replaced by a blank, exhausted stare. Lena peeked over his shoulder. "Looks like he's not enjoying Belize after all," he snorted. "No tropical drinks for him." But victory was bittersweet. For every corrupt official exposed, thousands of homeowners across the country were still suffering quietly, intimidated into selling homes, fleeing neighborhoods they'd loved for decades. The calls and emails kept pouring, and a single mother in Michigan sobbed over Zoom as she explained how her HOA threatened to auction her home over a missing fence picket. A Navy veteran in California described how his HOA banned him from flying his service flag and fined him into near bankruptcy. Lena would listen to each story, tears sometimes streaming down her cheeks, and then firmly guide each person through their options, document everything, connect with legal aid, stand together. Each success story became another stone in their foundation. One evening, Jim Carson called them over for a backyard gathering. Lanterns glowed among tree branches. Neighbors sat in lawn chairs, passing plates of ribs and baked beans. Children chased lightning bugs. The smell of barbecue and summer grass filled the air. Jim raised a glass. "To Lena and her husband, for teaching us that courage isn't just fighting back. It's refusing to be driven out." People cheered. Lena blushed, burying her face against his shoulder, but he gently nudged her forward. "Say something," he murmured. Lena lifted her head, voice trembling but clear. "I used to think this neighborhood was perfect because it was quiet. But it wasn't. It was quiet because people were afraid. Now it's loud, and that's how I know it's safe." The crowd roared with applause. That night, as they walked home under stars, he felt as if the ground itself were more solid beneath his feet. This neighborhood, he thought, had become a fortress, not of walls or fences, but of unity. And that was a fortress no predator could breach. The days turned cooler as autumn painted the trees in crimson and gold. The neighborhood hummed with a strange blend of relief and restless energy. People were friendlier now, but cautious. Smiles came quicker, but so did anxious glances when unknown vehicles cruised slowly by. He and Lena kept working tirelessly. Their dining table became a command center, cluttered with laptops, sticky notes, stacks of printed articles, and coffee mugs. Lena's penmanship covered spiral notebooks with lists of contacts, legal statutes, and quotes from homeowners desperate for help. Some evenings, she'd sigh and rub her temples. "Sometimes, I feel like we're trying to stop a tidal wave with a teaspoon," he would answer. "Yeah, but at least we're not standing there empty-handed." Emails poured in, often heartbreaking. A retired couple in Arizona described how their HOA fined them $5,000 because their desert-friendly landscaping was declared unsightly. A veteran in Tennessee shared how an HOA tried to evict him over a backyard tool shed. One woman in Colorado discovered hidden cameras aimed at her property, justified as monitoring for compliance. He and Lena realized the problem was national, vast, and rooted not just in greed, but in secrecy. Lena stared at a map one night, pins stuck into dozens of cities. "This is organized crime, isn't it?" she murmured. "They're not just rogue HOA boards. It's an entire industry." He exhaled, his breath tight. "That's exactly what it is." But they kept pushing forward. The Neighborhood Integrity Alliance grew rapidly. Veterans groups partnered with them. Civil rights organizations offered lawyers. A network of investigative journalists formed a private Slack channel to coordinate information. They released toolkits online, guides on how to read HOA documents, how to file public records requests, how to demand fair hearings before paying fines. The download soared into the tens of thousands. At a community event in late October, Lena stood on stage in a local park, speaking into a microphone. She wore a simple blue sweater, hair pulled back, eyes blazing with purpose. "I used to think we were alone," she said. "But we're not. They wanted us isolated so they could pick us off one by one. Well, look around you. Look at how many of us there are." The crowd erupted in applause. People lined up afterward to speak with them. Some shared stories in whispers, as if still afraid the HOA might be listening. Others handed over manila folders filled with evidence, copies of letters, photos of contractors lurking outside windows, screenshots of threats. A frail elderly man pressed a folded piece of paper into Lena's hand. "It's my house. They're trying to take it," he said, voice trembling. "I built it with my own 2 hands 50 years ago." Lena wrapped him in a hug. "Not if we can help it." The story spread far beyond their county. Television networks ran specials titled, "Neighborhoods Under Siege." News anchors gravely informed viewers about a silent epidemic of HOA overreach. One day, they received a letter from a coalition of veterans groups, inviting them to testify at a national conference in Washington, D.C. "Lena," he said, holding up the letter. "Looks like they want us on the big stage again." Lena blinked, stunned. "Me? Who else? You're the toughest one here." A shy smile flickered across her face. "Guess I'll need a new dress." They traveled to D.C. in early November. Lena stood before a crowd of veterans, lawmakers, and advocates in a hotel ballroom glittering with chandeliers. Cameras broadcast her words to screens all around the room. "My husband taught me how to patch up wounds on the battlefield," she said. "But what we're dealing with now, that's a different kind of wound. It's the wound of losing your sense of home. The place where you're supposed to feel safe." She paused, swallowing. "We beat them in our neighborhood because we stood together. And that's how we'll beat them everywhere else." The room roared with applause, people rising to their feet. Afterward, strangers came up to shake their hands. A young man, tears shining in his eyes, confessed he'd nearly taken his own life because he thought losing his house meant losing his dignity. "But after hearing you too," he said, voice cracking, "I'm going to keep fighting." On the flight home, Lena stared out the plane window at the clouds below. "I used to be afraid of speaking out," she murmured. "Now it feels like the only thing I know how to do." He squeezed her hand. "And you're damn good at it." When they landed, neighbors greeted them like returning heroes. Someone had hung a banner across their porch, "Welcome home, fighters." But back in their quiet house, reality quickly set back in. They discovered new letters slipped under their door. No return address. No signatures. Just words scrawled in black ink. Enough. Walk away while you still can. He felt the familiar pulse of rage tighten in his chest. He wanted to find whoever wrote it and confront them. But Lena gently touched his arm. That's what they want, to make us scared again. We're not giving them that. He took a deep breath. She was right. He scanned the neighborhood the next morning, looking for anything unusual. It felt different now. Before, he'd been looking out for a single predator. Now he was scanning for entire systems disguised as legitimate businesses. But the neighborhood felt alive, too. People waved. Kids biked past, streamers fluttering from handlebars. A neighbor shouted thanks from across the street. Mrs. Hernandez knocked on their door with a tray of fresh pan dulce. She insisted they sit on the porch while she poured coffee from a thermos. I used to think this block was quiet because it was perfect, she said, her voice soft. But now I see, it was quiet because we were afraid. Now it's noisy. And that means we're awake. Lena smiled. That's the best noise in the world. He gazed out at the trees, red and gold leaves swirling around the street, and realized the neighborhood had transformed into something stronger than it had ever been. Not perfect, but real. People were talking, helping one another, watching for signs of danger, not in fear, but in solidarity. He knew they hadn't finished the fight. New schemes would appear. Greedy men would try again, using new companies and new tactics. But the community was armed now, not with weapons, but with knowledge. With unity. That, he thought, was the most powerful defense of all. Months turned into half a year, and still the neighborhood bore invisible scars, though on the surface things seemed calmer. Spring arrived with an explosion of color. Azaleas bloomed, bees hovered over blossoms, and birds reclaimed the quiet spaces once occupied by security cameras and menacing strangers. Yet beneath the relief, there was still a tremor of anxiety, like a distant thunderstorm on a sunny day. He began to sleep, slightly better, though occasionally he jolted awake, ears tuned for footsteps on gravel. Lena sometimes murmured in her sleep, her body tensing as if bracing for impact. In those moments, he would reach over, gently stroking her hair, reminding himself that they'd survived worse. That they were still here. In the neighborhood, healing took many shape. The new HOA board settled into its role. The Navy veteran president, Jim Carson, turned out to be practical and transparent. He insisted on reading every financial report aloud at meetings. He also introduced an emergency fund to help any neighbor threatened with legal harassment. No one fights alone anymore, he said, to raucous applause, and yet, remnants of the old guard still lingered. A few residents, those who had benefited, quietly or otherwise, from the previous power structure, continued muttering about rabble-rousers and troublemakers. An older man named Mr. Rowley, who had always seemed genteel, but had secretly relished wielding HOA authority, refused to attend meetings. He left notes in mailboxes warning people that outsiders are watching, and predicting the community's decline. Still, the majority had shifted. The fear that once kept doors closed now kept them open. Neighbors shared phone numbers. They compared any strange letters they received. When a suspicious contractor showed up one afternoon, half the block appeared within minutes, cameras rolling, asking questions. The contractor left so quickly he nearly backed into a fire hydrant. As legal proceedings continued, the scale of the conspiracy became clearer. Federal prosecutors expanded indictments beyond ward law. Names surfaced: contractors, lawyers, property appraisers, linked to an entire network designed to siphon wealth from vulnerable homeowners. Testimony described intimidation playbooks, including sabotage of utilities, planting false evidence of code violations, and covert intimidation with vehicles trailing residents late at night. He sat in court many days, a silent sentinel. He heard stories from other communities: an elderly couple in Arizona whose home was seized over a disputed mailbox color, a disabled vet in Nevada whose utilities were cut repeatedly until he sold his home at a loss. Each tale felt personal. Each tale felt like a battle still left to fight. Between court dates, he poured himself into neighborhood projects. He and Lena started a community patrol, not for vigilante justice, but for gentle reassurance. They walked the streets, waving at neighbors, checking on elderly residents. Mrs. Hernandez joined them sometimes, despite her arthritis, insisting on baking cookies to hand out along the route. One evening, while repairing a neighbor's fence, he found himself reflecting on the differences between this fight and the combat zones of his past. In war, the enemy wore uniforms, carried weapons, declared themselves openly. Here, the enemy hid behind polite letters, legal jargon, and the mask of civic duty. But the stakes were no less profound. Home, safety, community. Local media kept following their story. Sarah, the young journalist who'd helped break it open, won awards for her reporting. She visited their home to interview them for a documentary. Cameras rolled as he spoke about the quiet terror of seeing his wife hurt in her own yard, about watching neighbors driven to the brink by fear. Lena spoke too, her voice strong, no longer trembling like that night on the porch. People think the American dream is just about owning a home, she said. But it's also about feeling safe in it. About knowing your neighbors have your back. The documentary aired nationwide. Messages poured in from across the country. Veterans, retirees, single parents, people who'd faced similar threats from overreaching HOs or predatory investors. Many wrote to say they felt alone until they'd seen the story. He and Lena decided to help however they could. They started volunteering with housing rights groups. Lena organized workshops on how to read HOA bylaws and spot fraudulent citations. He spoke to veteran organizations about protecting fellow service members from property scams. One day, a couple drove 3 hours to their neighborhood just to thank them. The man, a Vietnam veteran, broke down sobbing as he explained how his HOA had tried to evict him over a flagpole. I thought I was going to lose everything, he said. But you gave me hope. Lena hugged him tightly, as though she could transfer her strength by touch alone. Meanwhile, federal investigators kept tracing connections. They uncovered how Civic Asset Solutions operated in several other states, using identical tactics. The scale was breathtaking: millions in fraudulent fees, hundreds of families displaced, homes flipped for profit. Legislators began drafting new laws to regulate HOA powers, requiring independent oversight and limiting fines. Yet there were days when the burden felt heavy. He occasionally caught himself scanning rooftops for hidden cameras, or watching unfamiliar cars a little too closely. Lena sometimes sat silent for long stretches, staring into her coffee, until he gently pulled her back into the moment. But the victories kept coming. Late one afternoon, the neighborhood gathered for the unveiling of a new plaque in the community hall. It read, "In honor of all who stood together, protected the vulnerable, and proved that justice belongs to those who refuse to be silent." People clapped. He felt his eyes sting unexpectedly. Afterward, they held a block party. Tables sagged under plates of food. Children played tag beneath strings of lights. Neighbors swapped stories, laughter echoing under the twilight sky. A local guitarist strummed gentle folk songs. Even Mr. Rowley wandered in, grumbling about too much noise, but accepted a slice of peach pie and stayed. Lena pulled him aside. Her eyes sparkled under the lights. "We did it," she whispered. He hugged her, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. "We all did it," he replied. At the edge of the party, he saw Sarah, the journalist, standing with her notebook, quietly observing. She caught his eyes, smiled, and mouthed, "Thank you." In that moment, he felt something click into place. This was the real victory. Not just the arrests or the legal reforms, but the fact that people no longer feared speaking the truth. That neighbors were no longer strangers. That darkness had been driven out by collective light. A few weeks later, he received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from the HOA. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was from a senator's office, inviting him and Lena to testify before Congress about HOA reform. They wanted to hear how predatory associations used laws intended for community upkeep to commit financial abuse. He looked at Lena, holding the letter. She raised an eyebrow. "You up for one more fight?" He smiled. "Always." They traveled to Washington, D.C. together, walked the marbled halls of government buildings, sat beneath grand chandeliers in hearing rooms. Lena wore her navy blue dress again, the same one from Mom's trial. He wore a suit and his old service pin. When it was their turn, he spoke of seeing fear drain color from his wife's face, of watching neighbors' lives nearly collapse under manufactured debts, of hidden cameras, illegal data gathering, and the corporate predators lurking behind the respectable mask of HOA boards. Lena told Congress, "We nearly lost our home, but worse, we nearly lost our faith in our country. Don't let that happen to anyone else." Lawmakers applauded. Reporters gathered around them afterward. Bills were drafted to increase HOA accountability. State representatives from across the country called for similar changes. Back home, neighbors welcomed them like returning heroes. The community voted unanimously to rename their Central Park Unity Green. At the entrance, they planted a flowering dogwood tree, with a small plaque at its base. To those who stood, and those who will stand again. On sunny afternoons, he liked to sit under that tree with Lena. They'd watch kids play on the swings. Birds flit among the branches. Neighbors wave hello. The air smelled of grass and possibility. He reflected often on how close they'd come to losing everything, not just property, but peace of mind, trust, the sense that their home was truly theirs. And he thought of those who were still fighting similar battles in other towns, other states, because he knew this wasn't over. Systems of greed and intimidation always tried to reinvent themselves. But he also knew that people, once awakened, could not so easily be silenced again. He and Lena promised each other that they would stay vigilant, that they would keep helping others, that no neighbor would ever feel alone again. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he caught Lena's gaze lingering on the horizon. And he knew she was remembering the night she'd stood on their porch, blood on her lip, fear in her eyes. He'd seen her transform from a survivor into a fighter, and now into a leader. And he felt grateful for the battle they'd won, for the neighbors they'd saved, for the home they defended with every ounce of courage they possessed. He looked around the neighborhood, freshly painted fences, laughter ringing through the trees, the gentle flutter of the American flag over the community hall, and he felt certain of one truth. Home isn't just a place. It's the people who will stand beside you when darkness comes knocking. And he knew that no matter what might come next, they were ready. Summer arrived in a rush of heat waves and brilliant sun. Days grew longer, stretching into golden evenings. Lena planted more flowers than ever before, turning their yard into a riot of color, purple coneflowers, blazing orange daylilies, gentle drifts of lavender. She said she wanted the house to feel alive again. Neighbors wandered past on evening walks, waving and chatting. Sometimes they lingered by the fence, remembering how not so long ago, it had been a symbol of conflict and fear. Now it stood tall, freshly painted, as if guarding not just their property, but their dignity. One evening, as the cicadas hummed and the last pink streaks of sunset faded, Lena settled into a lawn chair beside him. She tilted her face to the sky, exhaling slowly. He and Lena traveled to several towns to speak at community meetings. Each time, he saw the same weary fear in people's eyes. Each time, he saw hope flicker when they shared their story. At a gathering in a Florida retirement community, a man in a Korean War veteran's cap approached him. "I thought I was crazy," the man confessed. "They've been fighting me for my wife's rose bushes," said the color attracts bugs. "It's just roses. We planted them 40 years ago." His voice broke. "Thank you for reminding me I'm not alone." Lena hugged him gently, as if willing him strength. One night, exhausted from traveling, he sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the scattered notes and news clippings piled before him. He wondered whether the fight would ever truly be over, whether new predators would simply find smarter ways to hide. Lena joined him, sliding into the chair beside him. "You know what you're forgetting?" she said, her eyes bright despite her fatigue. "What?" "That now people know how to fight back. That's what they can't undo." He exhaled, letting her words sink in. She was right. The enemy could shift tactics, change names, build new shell companies, but the people were awake now. Meanwhile, back in their neighborhood, the summer rolled forward. The new HOA hosted a 4th of July parade with streamers and a veterans color guard. Kids painted faces red, white, and blue. Fireworks boomed overhead, each burst reflecting in the windows of houses that, not so long ago, had stood under siege. During the parade, Jim Carson, the HOA president, gave a short speech. This neighborhood belongs to its people. We keep it safe, not with threats and secrets, but by standing together. Applause rolled down the block like thunder. He and Lena marched near the front, carrying a banner that read United Neighbors Against Abuse. As they passed, people clapped and whistled. Some reached out to shake his hand. He spotted Mrs. Hernandez waving 2 tiny flags, tears in her eyes. Later, at the community barbecue, he and Lena stood side by side, plates in hand, listening to music under the glow of lanterns. Neighbors clustered in small groups, laughing, sharing memories. The scent of grilled burgers mingled with blooming roses. Sarah, the journalist, approached them again. You know, she said, this neighborhood is going to be famous. You're going to be part of history books on HOA reform. He chuckled. I never wanted to be famous. Just wanted to live in peace. Sarah tilted her head. Well, thanks to you, a lot more people might get to. He thought about that as he looked around the crowded park. About how one violent incident, a stranger striking his wife, had been the first tremor that broke open an entire world of corruption. About how the fight had grown so much bigger than their own fence. He also thought of how close they'd come to losing hope. Of how easy it would have been to give up, pay the fines, move away quietly. But if they'd done that, none of these people would be here, celebrating freedom and community under the stars. He took a long breath and smiled as he watched Lena laughing with neighbors. As darkness fell, and the last fireworks faded, he felt something different settle in his chest. Not the adrenaline of battle. Not the lingering fear of retaliation. But a quieter, deeper feeling. A certainty that no matter how relentless corruption might be, good people, working together, could still win. Not because they were stronger individually, but because they were united. And that, he realized, was the true victory. The real American dream wasn't just a house behind a fence. It was knowing your neighbors would stand beside you when the wolves came knocking. And now, thanks to what they'd all been through, those wolves would have to think twice before ever coming back. The summer waned, drifting into early fall. Warm days still held on, but evenings carried a crispness that hinted at change. Leaves blushed red and gold along the neighborhood streets, fluttering gently onto sidewalks where children once chopped hopscotch squares. He often found himself wandering the block in the cool twilight, nodding greetings to neighbors tidying yards or watering flowers. Each familiar face was a reminder that they'd come through a storm together. But for all the visible healing, he knew wounds ran deeper than appearances. One evening, as he and Lena shared a quiet dinner, she set down her fork and said softly, Sometimes I'm still afraid. Not because of them showing up again, but because I know how easy it would be for it all to start over. Somewhere else. To someone else. He reached across the table, gripping her hand. That's why we keep talking about it. That's why we help. Lena nodded, her eyes glistening. I just wish I'd known sooner how big it was. How many people were suffering the same way. It's not just fences. It's people's lives. He squeezed her hand. And that's what makes it worth fighting for. Meanwhile, invitations kept arriving from advocacy groups, journalists, and even documentary filmmakers. People wanted to hear the story firsthand. They wanted him and Lena to testify, to give interviews, to share strategies. At first, he hesitated. He was a man who preferred privacy, who'd spent most of his life handling crisis quietly, decisively, without fanfare. Yet every time he considered stepping back, he remembered neighbors like Mrs. Hernandez. He remembered veterans terrified of losing homes. He remembered the silver SUV circling his block in the dark. So, they kept speaking. At one conference, held in Chicago, he stood on stage in front of a crowd of nearly 1,000 people, homeowners, lawyers, legislators, journalists. He held up a faded photo of his fence, battered and leaning, from before the fight began. This, he said, voice low, was the beginning of the war. I didn't know I'd have to fight. It's not about fences. It's about power. It's about people using fear to take what they don't deserve. Lena joined him on stage, her voice ringing out as she added. But we learned that communities can stand together. We learned that one voice becomes many. And that's how you beat people who hide in the shadows. The audience rose to their feet, clapping, some shouting words of thanks. Afterward, a woman in her 60s approached them, eyes brimming with tears. She explained that she nearly lost her home over a $600 fine for improper shrubbery maintenance. Her HOA had threatened liens, court costs, escalating fines. She'd lived in fear every day, terrified she'd end up homeless. I didn't think anyone would ever understand, she whispered. I thought I was weak. Lena embraced her. You're not weak. You're brave. And you're not alone anymore. They left the conference both exhausted and galvanized. At home, the neighborhood continued to blossom into something new. A high school teacher started a neighborhood newsletter highlighting acts of kindness instead of fines. Neighbors held free barbecues for veterans, sponsored by local businesses. The community hall hosted workshops where pro bono lawyers taught homeowners how to decipher legal notices and fight back against fraudulent fees. The sense of solidarity ran deeper than ever. Still, the threat never disappeared completely. In September, news broke that a new company, Liberty Ridge Development LLC, was buying up entire blocks in a nearby town. Residents there started receiving letters suspiciously similar to the ones Lena had once received, threats about minor violations, demands for expensive repairs. It was the same pattern all over again. He and Lena drove out there one Saturday, bringing binders of resources and copies of the federal case documents. They spoke to terrified homeowners huddled in folding chairs in a community park. People gathered around them, desperate for answers. Start documenting everything, he told them. Every letter, every photo, every conversation, Lena added. And talk to your neighbors. Don't let them isolate you. That night, as they drove home, he stared out the window, haunted by the look in those strangers' eyes. I hate that it's happening all over again, he said quietly. Lena reached across the center console and laid her hand over his. But this time, people know how to fight back. And they have us. He turned to look at her, pride and sadness mingling in his chest. Meanwhile, the federal investigations continued widening. Lawmakers began debating nationwide reforms, that would impose federal oversight on HOA practices where civil rights were threatened. Major networks aired special reports titled, "When Your HOA Becomes the Enemy." The Department of Justice formed a task force dedicated to investigating predatory housing practices. A senator who'd heard their testimony introduced a bill named after Lena, the Lena Act, Legal Equity for Neighborhood Advocacy. It proposed stronger homeowner protections, stricter financial reporting for HOAs, and severe penalties for using surveillance or harassment to force people from their homes. When Lena heard, she blinked in shock. "My name in a law?" she said, voice trembling. He grinned. "They couldn't have picked a better name for fighting back." Months later, the law passed the Senate unanimously. House debates were underway. One chilly evening, as leaves drifted like confetti around their porch, Lena came outside carrying 2 mugs of steaming cocoa. She pressed one into his hands and sat beside him. "I've been thinking," she said. "When this all started, if you told me we'd end up in Washington testifying, helping other neighborhoods, I wouldn't have believed you." He chuckled. "Neither would I." She grew quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I used to think fighting meant shouting or punching back. But sometimes fighting is just refusing to give up your place. Refusing to leave. Standing your ground." He looked at her, feeling a surge of love and respect so deep it made his chest ache. "That's exactly what it means." She sipped her cocoa. "We saved this place, you know. All of us. Together." He stared out at the neighborhood. Houses lit warm in the gathering dusk. A couple pushing a stroller down the sidewalk. Kids chasing each other across front lawns. "Yes," he said. "We did." And he knew that although new threats would always appear, new names, new companies, new tactics, they were no longer the same vulnerable community. Now, they were a network. A coalition. A neighborhood who'd found its voice. The true victory wasn't simply toppling Ward Lom or the corrupt HOA. It was that they'd learned to look out for each other. That neighbors had gone from strangers to allies. That Mrs. Hernandez could sit on her porch without flinching when a stranger passed by. Above all, he realized, the fight had reminded them all of a simple truth. Home wasn't just property lines and fences. Home was people willing to stand side by side when the wolves came knocking. And as long as that spirit remained alive, he believed, no predator, no matter how powerful, would ever fully conquer them again.